we're looking in chapter 11. That's got the famous words of communion that Jesus said, but we're not actually going to look at those particular words in chapter 11. We're going to look at the bits at the beginning and the bits at the end and in the middle, which are talking about two issues that we also need to think about when we come to worship. And as we've said, all of you know, right through this morning, we come to worship to focus on the Lord, on God. But we also are human. And we notice the other people, as we should. They're not nothing, are you, Dave?
No.
Good. You don't look like a nothing. You see, you can live and breathe and answer back. We have people around us. So there are two issues that come up particularly, but the bottom line in looking at these two issues in Paul's mind is consider one another. So as you come to worship the Lord, don't forget that there are other people in the same place who are also worshipping the Lord, and they are people, and we need to consider them. And, you know, some days we come feeling great, some days we come feeling distressed, some days, well, we don't come, some days, yeah, well, we're mixture, we're people, all of that. And we don't even necessarily tell you what's been going on, but we can anticipate some things, and some things we need to listen. I'm going to do the second issue first. It's a little bit shorter to deal with. And it starts at verse 17. No, I'm going to read just from verse 20, sorry. I'm going to read first of all from verse 20 to 22, and it's about coming together to take the Lord's Supper. Now, when we take the Lord's Supper, which we just did, there's a little tiny bit of cracker bread, gluten-free cracker bread, so make sure we cover those who are gluten-free, which is, you know, only about this big. It's not going to give you a full-size meal, at least not the way I like to eat a full-size meal. And as far as drink goes, you just get about that much, at least in this church. But when they came together, it was a full-size meal. And so they ate and they drank like a meal, as much as they wanted. And they did it in the presence of the Lord, and in that course of taking that meal, there would be scriptures shared, there would be people leading in prayer, there would be people teaching, and what he also calls prophesying, which included teaching from the scriptures, words of encouragement, and whatever else was, you know, appropriate to share. All of that happened over the meal. That was church. It was always in a house. So us being in the church house is quite biblical in terms of the pattern that was used back in those days. They weren't allowed to build special buildings anyway, so there ain't no choice for them in a house. So he starts here, verse 20. When you come together, it is not the Lord's Supper you eat. For as you eat, now that statement would have shocked them, wouldn't it? And said, Paul, excuse me, we are coming to have the Lord's Supper. And he's saying, no, it's not. For as you eat, each of you goes ahead without waiting for anybody else. Right? You're just concerned about your stomach, not about sharing the meal with the other people. Then listen to the next bit. One remains hungry, another gets drunk. Well, you know, that's abuse, isn't it? Don't you have homes to eat and drink in, or do you despise the church of God and humiliate those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you for this? Certainly not. Now, that's not exactly our issue here, but I think we can transfer that to understand it. And who are the people who are likely to be the ones going hungry? Well, if we think about the context, it's the slaves. The slaves are the ones who could not just leave and turn up whenever they wanted to. The slaves were slaves to their masters, which means they had to get their master's meals at home first, and they could not leave until their master says, it's okay, you've done your job now and you're free to go. So they're the ones who are not free to come early. Who are the ones that are coming early? The free people, the rich people, the ones who are used to getting their own way, calling the shots, saying, okay, I feel hungry, so look, now, I'm going to go and get food, or you're going to have it brought to me. That's their lifestyle. And yet when they come to church, Paul treats them as one body. Right? Back in their jobs, in their homes, some are called masters, some are called slaves. But as soon as you come to church, all of that disappears. You're all one. Doesn't matter where you come from, it doesn't matter how much money you do or don't have, it doesn't matter what sort of a house you do or don't live in, all of that disappears. You come to church and you are meant to consider each other as an equal person before the Lord. Now that's really important because this is pretty countercultural. That's not the way the world's worked. And we've probably all been in some places where we feel, not quite of the right social status, or, not quite regarded as highly as, certain people over there, whether maybe they dress more nicely, or maybe they're very famous, or, maybe they are known to have money. I'm not saying that's a problem in this church, because I don't see it as a problem in this church. But the principle I think we've just got to keep in mind of when we come to church, we come as equals, irrespective of whatever else happens in our lives. Doesn't matter whether we're famous or rich or not famous or very poor or whatever. We all come, and we need to consider one another and respect one another as people. Now he repeats it again down verse 33. So then, my brothers and sisters, when you come together to eat, wait for each other. So he's really making the point, isn't he? If anyone is hungry, you can eat at home, so that when you meet together, it may not result in judgment. It's not that God is judging how much you eat or what you eat, or that he's all that concerned about food by itself. What he's concerned about is how you're behaving towards one another. That's the point. Okay, let's turn to the more tricky issue here in the first part of chapter 11, and that concerns dress codes. That's a bit of a touchy subject in most places. And I've been the subject of all kinds of comments of dress codes, but, travelling around the world, your skirt should be this length or that length, or, whatever length, or no skirt, or trousers or no trousers, or, earrings or no earrings, or you can go on and on, and wherever I am, I seem to not quite try my best, but, it's a cultural thing. This is particularly a cultural issue. So he makes it clear in a few places that this is about particularly women's dress. I don't normally preach on this passage. I happen to be a woman. But anyway, his argument is kind of complicated a bit because Paul tends to write in circles, Some people you can just go in a straight line and get it like that. And when he's going around in circles, it's usually because he's thinking in a very Jewish way, saying, do you remember Fiddler on the Roof?
Yes.
On the one hand this, and on the one hand that, and you can go back and forth, and this and that, and this and that, and this and that, and you think, well, make up your mind, which way is it,
Yes.
It's a very Jewish way of trying to sort out what your argument really is, whereas we'd like to just get to the point. Paul, write it clear in 1 or 2 sentences that I can read and understand instead of going around the world in all of this and that and that. But he's really speaking to a Jewish audience, so that's why he's kind of going that sort of way. And he is a Jewish man himself. So he starts off by talking about men and women, and then you start getting the thing, is he talking about some people have thought, is he talking about not letting a woman speak or lead or prophesy or lead prayers or anything like that in church? No, that's not the point, because he says when a man leads or prophesies in church, he needs to dress in this sort of way. When a woman prays and prophesies in church, she needs to dress in this sort of way. It's about dress. Again, food and dress. Basic stuff. And you think, what do we come to worship for? What's this got to do with worship? But again, the bottom line is consider one another. So just on this whole women question, just to clear it up a little bit, I don't have time to do a whole study of it. I wrote a little booklet years ago, this one called Women in Ministry ? I've got a couple of spare copies with me. If anybody wants one, just come and ask me. It's in my bag down there. Where I look at all the relevant passages on that one. And some people, well, a lot of people actually, around the world have found it helpful. And it's not too hard. It's not meant to be hard. And I don't think it should be. But just let me look at the background a little bit. To answer the question of can women be leading? Can this include teaching? Can it include preaching? Can it include all that stuff? Can it include what I'm doing? I had to really work through this because I had grown up with a very, very strong teaching. Women must be quiet. Women must not speak in church. Women must not stand up. Well, it's just like, women couldn't even take up the offering, and women couldn't serve communion, and women certainly couldn't lead a prayer in church. In fact, none of those jobs that we've got women doing freely in this church could women do. Not one. Women could only do jobs that were hidden behind the scenes. And that's how it was. That's how it was in a lot of churches. And I accepted that. It's not a question of did I like it or not, I just accepted it. I remember asking a minister when I was 14, I said, I was very naive, didn't come from a Christian family or anything, and I said, I noticed that there's no women preaching and, leading communion and all those sorts of things. And I just naively asked, I was thinking, maybe they're just not on the roster. Because I went to a school that was very much, it was an academically selective school where girls were told that, we could study and we could do anything. I went to church, when I could get to church, which wasn't very often, but I noticed there's no women doing things. So I said to this wonderful minister, I said, I just noticed that. Is there a reason for this? He said, well, dear, the Bible says that women are not allowed to preach or teach or do any of those things. And I absolutely accepted it. He was such a wonderful, godly minister. Many, many, many years later, when he was now had his legs chopped off and was in a nursing home and, not in a good state and not much longer to live, only in fact another few months. I said to Stuart, I really, really want to go and see him. Such a wonderful man, really. And I don't care what he thinks about this. And at this stage, I was about to be ordained as a minister after lots of struggle, and that's another big story. And so when we were in Sydney, Stuart and I went to see Mr. Hart, and he was again so very gracious, so very accepting, so very welcoming, such a wonderful, godly Christian example. And then he asked me a few awkward questions, like, what are you doing now? And I thought, I don't want to tell him. Why can't he talk about something else? But of course he was a little too perceptive. And so I ended up telling him, and I thought, oh, well, he'll just probably tell me, this is all wrong. But anyway, I still wanted to see him as such a man. And he said to me, well, dear, I've changed my mind.
Oh, well.
He remembered telling me that when I was 14. And since then, he had met, when he was actually in ministry in England, he'd met a woman minister in his area. And that was what really made him struggle and search. And he did a lot of searching and a lot of reading of the Bible, talking to people, thinking about it. And that's what caused him to change his mind. And so then I told him that I was going to be ordained probably in about a week or so later. Unfortunately, he rang our phone number to just to say he was praying, but we were not at home, and our son answered the phone, took the message, and he died very, very soon after that. So I was disappointed that I didn't get to talk to him. But he was a great encourager, and even though, he was trying to be faithful, I was trying to be faithful until God, told me he had a job for me to do. But let's go back to Paul's world. Was he of that mindset? If we just look at the end, the very last chapter of Romans, it's mostly a list of names, which we usually write off and think it's boring. What's the point of a chapter ending Romans with all of his friends? We don't need to know all of his friends. They don't mean anything to us. But we can go through that whole chapter and we can discover a few interesting things. The first one is that this letter is being taken to Rome by a woman, Phoebe. Now, who is she? My translation here calls her a servant of the church in Kencray. That's actually the same word as minister. Minister means servant. Some translations say she's a deacon or a deaconess. The actual Greek word there means the one who stands in front. She's the leader of the church in Kencray. So we would call her the pastor or the minister, something like that. There may have been others on the team. We don't know. But she had a leadership role in Kencray. And Paul trusted her to be the one who brought the letter to these new Christians in Rome. Now, if she's going to bring the letter, she was going to go there with a job to do. And that was going to be to explain and teach on, to help people to understand what Paul is writing, and including his chapter 11, where it's all very circlish, his argument. She would be the one who had talked to Paul, who understood what he meant, to say this is what he means. Now that's a pretty important role, so he trusted her to do that. We have all these lists of names. There's probably about 16 of them, I think. A third of them are women. Now, this is unusual. The second thing that's unusual is that there's often an expression saying a particular person's name and then saying they worked hard in the Lord, or they worked hard, and it's always understood in the Lord. It doesn't mean digging dirt or washing up or sweeping the floor. It's gospel working hard, which means these are people who are right at the hub of ministry. These are people who are explaining Christian truths to other people, whether it's in conversations, whether it's talking to a group. That's what they're doing. A third of them are women. So Paul cannot possibly mean that he doesn't allow women to do anything. In fact, before we get to this strange chapter 11, I'm going to go to another place in Corinthians which seems to say the opposite. But I think we can understand it in this context. In 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verses 34 and 35, Women should remain silent, which would be better translated as quiet. It's the same word that we use to mean a person is a quiet person, meaning they're not a noisy person. It's not literally silent, but anyway, that's the way that it has been translated in English. In not all versions, but in the one I've got and in many. The women are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission, as the law says. If they want to inquire about something, they should ask their own husbands at home, for it is disgraceful for a woman to speak in the church. Well, you think, Paul, what do you mean? You just commended Phoebe for standing up in front of the church in Kencray. You've got a list here at the end of Romans, a third of whom are women, and there certainly are speaking in the churches, in these groups. So can Paul possibly mean absolute no speaking, zip mouth? I should sit down. Well, I shouldn't even be talking over morning tea, should I? If you're going to take it literally. But again, it's quiet. And there's a few suggestions for what it means, but the most obvious one to me is because we've got to understand the women sat on one side of the church, the men sat on the other side of the church, and that was the case in their culture, that's what they did. And so the women were younger and they didn't have the same education as the men in most cases, unless your father happened to be a rabbi, and there were some women who therefore got better education. So women are naturally just as intelligent and curious as men are, and they want to know the answers. And so what they're going to do is call out to their husband over there, Fred, what is he talking about? Can you explain it to me? Can you tell me? And he's saying, well, it's okay for the women to ask the questions, but don't be disruptive. And if we read the whole context in chapter 14, it's all about, it's again a form of considering one another. Don't be disruptive. Do your asking, do your research at home. You ask the people around you who have been to school and who know a bit more and can read, there's usually your husband, and, find out, yes, find out. But you don't disrupt a church meeting to do it. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. That's the point. Now let's come back to 1 Corinthians chapter 11. This strange argument, and I'm going to read the first part. You might think, Paul, you're doing the head in, and I don't blame you if you think that, but I think we can unpack it. We're going to start at verse 3. Now I want you to realise that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonours his head. Now, that would be a shocking statement to Jewish people, because when the Jews pray, they wear a prayer shawl over their head and it hangs down here. Have you seen the pictures? Mm. It's usually white and it's got little threads on it and little tassels hanging down. They could not think of praying. A Jewish man, could not think of going to synagogue. It's the same today, without putting a prayer shawl on and having his head covered. So, we tend to miss that bit, but that is a shocking statement. Are you saying, Paul, that we don't need a prayer shawl? Men don't need to have a prayer shawl to pray? Yep, says Paul. Guess why? Well, we've been talking about the Lord's Supper, haven't we? Jesus died on the cross. What does the veil, the shawl represent? Represents the barrier because of sin between me and God. And when Jesus died on that cross, that barrier was taken away. So therefore, the man can stand there or sit there. We've got all men here with no prayer shawls on, no head coverings on, and your head is open to God. You can. There's nothing that needs to be in the way. Now, what about the women? how's he going to deal with them? And I've noticed that we don't have coverings on our heads either. But then he says, if a woman does, every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonours her head. Now, we need to understand what it means before deciding that we're all sinning. It is just as though her head was shaved. Right. Now, if I don't have a hat on, as of course many churches required women to wear in times past when I was a child, I had to wear a hat to Sunday school, and my sister was at the Brethren Church. She wasn't allowed in because in ignorance we didn't come from a Christian family, and she rolled up at the church, decided she'd like to go and see what happened on a Sunday night, and wasn't allowed in because she didn't have a hat on. Now, they probably were thinking she should know, but she didn't know, and it was a very risky thing in our family to be daring to go to church. So I felt a bit angry with that church for doing that. In other ways, that church was a wonderful church. So then we've got to think, okay, so the point of this, men, when they come to church, you don't wear head coverings. And that's stuck in our culture, hasn't it? Well, except when you go to North America and you find the guys sitting there with baseball caps back to front. Whether it's church or classroom or anywhere else, they just kind of wear them, And I think, okay, new interpretation. But, and in the times in which most people in this room have grown up, we have grown up with realising men take their hats off when they get into church if they're wearing a hat, as my father and Stuart's father used to do. That's what you do, you take it off. And that's in line with this passage. But what does it mean for a woman? So whatever it meant then not to have the head covering on was the same as having your hair shaved off. I do know that they didn't know about cancer, chemotherapy treatment and all that kind of stuff back then, so that's not in it. But what did it mean if a woman shaved her hair off? I'm sure some of you can tell me. It meant she was a prostitute. Oh. Now, would her husband be too pleased if she was coming to church, taking her veil off and giving the idea, in doing so, that she was a loose woman and therefore available? Well, I don't think, if you're going to be thinking about the glory, which he mentions in a minute, about the glory going to the husband, etc., I don't think that's giving a husband much glory. He's not going to be feeling too happy unless he's also a loose man and he doesn't care about such things, in which case something's a bit off, to say the least. So in other words, how is your dress code read by other people? Because that's the way people assess, are you an upright living person, or are you exposing yourself in a way that gives a wrong message? Or do you indeed mean that sort of message, sometimes I accidentally see these pictures of women who are only very minimally clad on the top half, and they've got this long dress on, but, you've seen them too, because we don't have a choice about it. And I think, what does the husband think about this, Because it kind of doesn't give a message of saying, I am faithful to my husband. And so I don't think Stuart would be too happy, is that right? If I started walking around clad like that. And I wouldn't be too happy if he was, exposing too much of his body either. So the point of the dress code here is, be careful that you are not giving the wrong message, because that's going to be damaging you. It's going to be damaging, if it's a woman who's married, it's going to be damaging the husband. It's also going to be damaging the church. It's going to be damaging Christ. So that's why this becomes important. And then he goes on to say, the verse 8, for man did not come from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. And then he says a very strange verse in verse 10, which nobody really understands. For this reason, and because of the angels, the woman ought to have a sign of authority on her head. It doesn't actually say, in the Greek it just says, have authority. She's got to have something on her head. Head's got to be covered in some way. But then a bit later he says that the hair can be the covering. So it doesn't actually have to be a hat or a veil. You can have hair that signifies that you are a woman, not a man. That goes back to the Old Testament where there's a rule about if you're a woman, dress as a woman. If you're a man, dress as a man. And if you start mixing it all up, then it's not a good idea, as we are discovering in this age. So he's just made a little statement, about man didn't come from a woman, but woman came from man, which sounds like, maybe the man's more important. And then he goes in his circular way, one hand this, one hand that. He then says in verse 11, however, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. Okay, they're equal in that sense. For as woman came from man, he then's come back and says, man also came from woman. So he's equalising the argument out to say, in the Lord, all that kind of talk is not very important. Because men are born from women. Women originally came from man a long time ago. But it's not a big deal. What is a big deal is how you dress. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not the very nature of things teach you that if a man has long hair, it's a disgrace to him? Well, you've got to think culturally, because actually what we call short hair and what they call short hair in his day were a bit different. I don't see any, like I'm just looking at Graham's hair at the moment. Yours is pretty short for a Jewish man. It was much more like, we don't have any men who've got it like that in this room. It's probably down to here, shoulder length even. And the woman's hair was allowed to grow longer. The point is, if you're a man, have your hair like a man. If you're a woman, have your hair in a woman's style, whatever it is. And in this day and age, we can have fairly short styles from women, but there are various ways of still being able to work out whether it's a women's style or a men's style. It's just basically the message is don't cause confusion, don't give mixed messages, be content who you are, and don't cause problems. If a woman has long hair, it is her glory. Long hair is given to her as a covering. So all the big deal about whether she's got a veil on or not is not even the last word. It's not even the point. She's got hair. So don't get hung up on whether you have to have a hat on. Don't get hung up on whether you've got to have hair of exactly a certain length, because I know my sister's Brethren Church, they had a big deal about that. If anyone wants to be contentious about this, we have no other practice than go to the churches of God. In other words, Paul says, don't start a fight about trivial stuff. Women are allowed to pray, lead prayers, to prophesy, which is also included in that is teaching from the Word and also connecting that with Jesus and all of that. But don't cause trouble unnecessarily. One lecturer I had suggested that, like if a woman got up and started to preach, but she was topless, there could be a bit of a problem, couldn't there? I'm glad you agree. That was Paul's point. Just be careful, be considerate in matters of food and drink, social class, how people, where they've come from, And, we have people, because we've been in a lot of different countries, people have different backgrounds. We teach students who are in a classroom together, and at the moment it's a Zoom classroom, and they can come from as many countries as there are students. Some of the customs are different. Don't start a fight about that sort of thing. Don't just say, my way's right. Well, actually, when you're the teacher of the class, you have the right to set certain rules. But apart from that, that's only for the smooth running of the class. That's all. That's the only thing we can set. But as for putting people up or down, just forget it. Dress appropriately. Be considerate when you eat that everybody doesn't eat all of something and stand there and consume it all without considering that there might be other people who also want to take part. Not a big deal. Be considerate of one another. Thank you.